In the high plains of Wyoming, in the autumn of 1903, the people of Sweetwater Crossing saw something that made them stop their wagons and stare. A woman, a widow named Eliza Gable, was digging a trench around her cabin. Not a small ditch for drainage. This was a trench 4 feet wide and 5 feet deep. She worked with a steady, quiet rhythm. The shovel rose and fell, the pile of dark earth growing beside the small, sturdy cabin her late husband had built. Neighbors thought she'd lost her mind to grief. They saw a woman digging a moat, as if to defend against an unseen army, or worse, a grave. The talk started at the general store, then moved to the church steps. It was a strange, unsettling sight. A monument to sorrow, some whispered. But Eliza Gable wasn't digging a grave. She was preparing for a war against the cold. And when the winter of 1904 hit, a winter of such brutal, relentless cold that it would be spoken of for 100 years, that crazy trench would prove the difference between survival and surrender. It would prove that the quiet widow understood something about the earth that every experienced builder in the valley had missed. If you want to see the number that made the county's best carpenters go silent, the single number that proved them all wrong, stay until the end. What did this former lighthouse keeper's daughter understand about thermodynamics that no one else did? Before we find out, take a second to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read everyone. Eliza Gable wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 32-year-old widow with a 7-year-old son, Thomas. She was just trying to keep him warm. She had come to Wyoming from the coast of Maine, a place of wet, biting cold, but a different kind of cold. Her late husband, Frank, had dreamed of ranching. He'd built them a solid cabin before a fever took him the previous spring. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. Thick lodgepole pine logs, well chinked with mud and straw, a stone fireplace, and a new cast-iron stove. It looked like a fortress against the winter. But their first winter, the winter of 1902, had been a brutal lesson. It taught Eliza that a fortress with a fatal flaw is no fortress at all. The wind on the high plains was a physical thing. It wasn't like the wind on the coast, which carried the damp chill of the sea. This was a dry, surgical cold, a wind that stripped heat from wood and stone with a relentless, invisible violence. She had burned through 7 cords of wood, 7. She fed the stove every 2 hours, day and night. The cabin never felt truly warm, it just felt less cold. Her son, Thomas, slept in his coat and 2 blankets, and still woke shivering in the night. Eliza would get up in the dark, her breath a cloud in the faint moonlight, and stuff rags along the baseboards, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. Frost bloomed on the inside of the walls. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. The cold didn't just seep through the walls, it came up from the floor. The floorboards were punishingly cold, a constant drain of warmth from their feet, from the very air in the room. That first winter, she'd felt helpless. She was doing everything the neighbors did, everything Frank had told her to do, and it was barely enough. She watched her son's face get pinched and pale. She saw the chilblains on his hands. That was a pain worse than the cold. It was the pain of failing to protect her child. Through that long, miserable winter, she observed. She was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper. For 20 years, she had lived in a stone tower on a rock in the North Atlantic. She understood wind. She understood insulation. She understood how a relentless, single-directional force could find the smallest weakness and exploit it. And she realized the problem wasn't just the wind against the walls, it was the ground beneath their feet. The high plain soil, once the deep cold set in, froze solid, 5, 6, 7 feet down. That vast frozen mass of earth acted like a giant block of ice pressed against the foundation of her cabin. It didn't just fail to insulate, it actively leached the heat out of the floorboards, out of the foundation stones, day and night. The earth became a relentless, silent thief of warmth. Wind strips heat through convection, but the frozen ground was stealing it through conduction, a direct, unstoppable transfer. Her neighbors fought the cold in the air. They built windbreaks, chinked their logs tighter, burned more wood. Eliza realized they were fighting the wrong enemy. The real enemy was the frozen earth itself. Her time in the lighthouse gave her the key. Her father's lighthouse had a deep stone foundation sunk into the bedrock of the island. In the summer, the cellar was cool, but in the winter, it was never as cold as the air outside. Below the frost line, the earth maintains a stable temperature. In her part of Wyoming, that was around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, all year round. The frozen ground was a heat sink, but the deep, unfrozen earth was a thermal battery, a constant, steady source of moderate temperature. Her plan formed from that single, simple insight. His plan was simple. If she couldn't stop the ground from freezing, she could stop the freeze from reaching her cabin. She had to create a buffer, an insulated barrier. She waited until late summer when the ground was dry and workable. The opportunity came when a neighboring rancher was selling off excess straw for pennies on the dollar after a good harvest. She bought 3 massive bales. Then she picked up her shovel. And as her neighbors watched and wondered, she began to dig. She didn't just dig, she engineered. The trench was her first tool. She marked out a line 4 feet from the cabin walls, all the way around. Then she started the back-breaking work. She dug down 5 feet, deeper than the frost line had reached, even in the worst winter on record. The topsoil was easy. Then came clay and rock. It was slow, grueling work for a woman alone, but every shovelful was an investment in her son's survival. She angled the inner wall of the trench slightly so it wouldn't collapse. The outer wall was straight. This created a wide, deep, empty space encircling her entire foundation. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. She wasn't just creating dead air space. Dead air insulates, yes, but her plan was more active than that. She took the straw she'd bought and packed it into the bottom 2 feet of the trench. The loose, dry straw was a fantastic insulator. It would stop the cold from the surface, from penetrating deep into the ground beside her cabin. On top of the straw, she layered pine boughs she gathered from the nearby hills, creating another layer of trapped air pockets. Then came the dirt she had excavated. She took that huge pile of earth and began piling it against the exposed log walls of the cabin itself, from the ground up to the level of the windowsills, about 4 feet high. This is a technique called banking, or creating a berm. Her neighbors did it, but usually with a small pile of dirt, just a foot or 2 high. Eliza was building a thick earthen wall. The dirt berm did 2 things. First, it added enormous thermal mass to the cabin walls. The sun would warm the earth during the day, and that earth would slowly release its heat back towards the cabin through the night. Second, it was the best windbreak imaginable. The Wyoming wind would now hit a solid, sloping wall of earth instead of vertical log walls full of tiny, heat-stealing cracks. The wind couldn't strip heat from a wall it couldn't touch. So now she had two systems working together. The insulated trench was protecting the foundation from the deep freezing ground. It was creating a zone of stable, 50-degree earth right next to her cabin, like a warm neighbor, and the earthen berm was protecting the walls from the wind and adding thermal mass. To finish it, she laid thick planks over the top of the trench, creating a narrow wooden deck or walkway around the house. She covered the planks with more dirt and sod, so it looked almost seamless with the surrounding ground. From the outside, the effect was jarring. It looked like her cabin had been sunk 4 feet into the ground, a little house huddling inside a man-made hillock. From outside, it looked like a fort had eaten a house. Total cost for the entire project, under $20. $15 for the straw, a few dollars for some used planks from the sawmill, and weeks of her own sweat. Thomas watched her for days. Finally, he asked the question everyone was thinking. "Mama, why are we burying the house?" Eliza paused, leaning on her shovel, and wiped her brow. "We're not burying it, sweet boy," she said, her voice steady and calm. "We're giving it a winter coat." Her son accepted the answer. The community did not. And when her neighbors saw the finished product, they didn't see engineering. They saw insanity. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with quiet concern. Then it grew into open mockery. The first to challenge her directly was Silas Blackwood. Silas ran the sawmill and had built nearly half the cabins in the valley, including this one for her husband. He was a good man, respected, and he knew his trade. He rode out one afternoon in October, his brow furrowed with genuine worry. He walked around the strange, bermed structure, kicking at the dirt. "Eliza," he said, his voice slow and heavy with authority, "what have you done here?" "I'm preparing for winter, Silas," she replied simply, not stopping her work stacking firewood. "You've dug a trench and piled wet earth against the logs," he said, shaking his head. "That's a recipe for disaster. The water will have nowhere to go when the snow melts. It'll pool in that trench, seep into your foundation stones, and rot the sill logs clean off this cabin in 2 years. You'll have mushrooms growing out of your floorboards." His objection was technical, specific, and it sounded entirely reasonable. It was based on 70 years of frontier building wisdom. Eliza just nodded. "I've allowed for drainage." "It's not in any building manual I've ever seen," Silas insisted. "Perhaps," she said, and that was all. She didn't argue. She didn't explain the principles of thermal mass or the frost line. She just kept working. Silas rode away, shaking his head, telling anyone who would listen that the poor widow Gable was going to destroy the fine cabin her husband had left her. The mockery grew louder at the general store. Jedediah Croft, a rancher with a booming voice and a cruel streak, saw her loading supplies one day. He called out across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Eliza, heard you're digging in for the winter. Digging your own grave, more like." A few men snickered. Eliza didn't flinch. She paid for her flour and left, her back straight. The nickname stuck. To some, she was now the gravedigger widow. The gossip network buzzed. At the church quilting circle, the women would fall silent when she entered the room. They spoke in hushed, pitying tones about her struggle since Frank's passing. They saw her project not as an act of competence, but as a symptom of a mind unmoored by grief. People would ride their horses out of their way just to pass her cabin and stare at the strange earthen mound. The institutional skeptic arrived in early November. Mr. Davies, the county extension agent, a man with a clipboard and a belief in government pamphlets. He'd heard the talk. He was polite but firm. "Mrs. Gable," he began, "I'm obligated to tell you that this kind of unapproved earthwork could affect the water table, and Mr. Blackwood has expressed concerns about structural integrity." "I've taken that into account," Eliza said, her voice level. It's highly unorthodox," Davies said, making a note on his clipboard. "There are approved methods for winterizing. This is not one of them." He left her with a pamphlet on proper insulation techniques, which included banking with manure. But the cut that went deepest came from family. Frank's younger brother, Arthur, rode in from Cheyenne for a visit. He was a man who cared deeply about appearances. He saw the burned cabin, and his face fell. That evening he sat her down. His voice was laced with a pained, frustrated concern that was worse than any mockery. "Eliza, what is this?" he asked, gesturing to the walls. "I heard talk in town. I didn't believe it. People are saying you've lost your senses since Frank died. They think you're either scared or incompetent. Maybe both. This is making a spectacle of the Gable name." That stung. The accusation of incompetence. The idea that she was dishonoring her husband's memory. But her voice, when she replied, was devoid of anger. It was flat. It was certain. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Arthur. I'm trying to keep my son warm." He left the next morning, convinced his sister-in-law was a lost cause. By the first week of December, not one person in Sweetwater Crossing thought Eliza Gable had solved anything. They thought she'd built a monument to her own foolishness, a dirt-caked memorial to a grief that had curdled into madness. They waited for the spring thaw, when they were sure her cabin would be a swampy, rotten mess. But they were waiting for the wrong season to prove their point. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Eliza right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1904 is still recorded in Wyoming's climatology archives. It's not just a story, it's a data point. It began with a hard freeze in the second week of the month, plunging temperatures to 10 below zero. That was just the overture. On December 18th, the main event arrived. A blizzard blew in from the north, a wall of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted. December 19th, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. December 21st, minus 31. On Christmas Eve, the thermometer at the general store, before it froze and burst, read minus 38 degrees. And that was without the wind. The wind was a constant, screaming force out of the northwest, gusting to 50 miles per hour. Wind chills dropped below minus 70. Snow didn't fall so much as it flew horizontally, driven by a force so relentless it scoured paint from barns and forced tiny ice crystals through the smallest cracks in a wall. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in Sweetwater Crossing never climbed above zero. It was a siege. The valley began to break. The cold was a physical, crushing enemy. It found every weakness. the community's suffering was immediate and specific. Silas Blackwood, the master builder, burned through his winter woodpile at a terrifying rate. His own well-built house, the pride of his career, struggled to hold 45 degrees. His wife and children lived in a small circle around the stove, wrapped in blankets, their world shrunk to a tiny island of less cold. The Colby Ranch, one of the biggest in the area, was burning 2 cords of wood per week. 2 cords, just to keep their main house at 40 degrees. Their cattle began to die, freezing in the fields. Other families, less prepared, grew desperate. Chimneys, overworked and poorly maintained, clogged with creosote and caught fire. Some started burning fence posts. The Williams family reportedly started breaking up their furniture to feed the stove after their woodpile, buried under an 8-foot drift, became unreachable. Children got sick. A hacking cough settled over the valley. The doctor was snowed in, unable to make his rounds. It was a slow-motion disaster, a daily battle for degrees. Every family was burning half a cord a week, a staggering amount, just to stay above freezing. The sound of axes splitting frozen wood became a constant, desperate drumbeat across the valley. And then, amid the smoke-choked, shivering misery, people started noticing the Gable place. Or rather, what they didn't notice. There was no plume of dense, desperate smoke pouring from her chimney, just a thin, lazy wisp, the kind you'd see on a mild autumn day. When the wind paused for a few hours on the 22nd, a neighbor riding out to check his livestock saw Eliza outside. She was in her shirt sleeves, calmly sweeping snow from the narrow walkway atop her trench. She wasn't bundled like a polar explorer. She moved with an easy, unhurried pace. She saw him, gave a simple nod, and went back inside. The sight was so wrong, so out of place with the surrounding reality, that the neighbor thought he might be delirious from the cold. A woman in shirt sleeves in the middle of the great freeze? Impossible. But he told the story at the store, and the story spread. Something strange was happening in the crazy widow's buried cabin. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It rewrote the rules. The vindication began on December 23rd. It began with an act of charity that was also an act of condescending pity. Silas Blackwood, his own face raw from the cold, loaded up a sled with a quarter cord of precious firewood. He was making a delivery to the Miller family, who were down to their last scraps. On the way, he decided to stop at Eliza Gable's place. He was certain she must be in the worst trouble of all. A lone woman, a child, in that strange dirt house he was sure was a death trap. He imagined them huddled under every blanket they owned, the fire long dead. He was coming to rescue her. He pulled his horse to a stop and trudged through the deep snow to her door. He knocked, expecting a long wait. The door opened almost immediately, and the warmth hit him. It wasn't a fire blast. It was a steady, enveloping, impossible warmth. It hit him like stepping from the brutal Wyoming winter directly into a mild spring afternoon. He physically recoiled from the shock of it. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He just stared. Eliza stood in the doorway. She wore a simple cotton dress, no shawl, no sweater. Behind her, through the cabin opening, Silas saw her son, Thomas. He was sitting on the floor, on a rug, playing with wooden blocks. He was in his shirt sleeves, not coats, not blankets, shirt sleeves. "Silas," Eliza said calmly, "everything all right?" He blinked, trying to make sense of the scene. The air that flowed out of the cabin was warm and dry. There was no scent of dampness, no hint of rot. I I brought you some wood, he stammered, gesturing toward the sled. I figured you might be running low. That's kind of you, she said, but we're managing fine. Everyone else is burning through their whole winter stock, Silas said, his voice a mixture of confusion and disbelief. We're burning half a cord a week just to keep from freezing. Eliza's reply was quiet, factual, and it broke his understanding of the world. We're burning less than a small bundle a day, she said. A cord will last us more than a month. Silas stared at her, then past her into the impossible comfort of the room. He stepped inside, uninvited, drawn by a need to understand. He looked at her woodbox. It was nearly full. He looked at the stove. Its door was closed, and it radiated a gentle, steady heat. It wasn't roaring. Then his eyes fell on the wall thermometer. He walked toward it like a man in a dream. He squinted, needing to see the number, to have the proof. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 61 degrees Fahrenheit. 61 degrees. Let that sink in for a moment. Outside, the wind howled, and the temperature was minus 32. A difference of 93 degrees. Silas had families on his list celebrating if they hit 40. He, the best builder in the county, was fighting a losing battle to keep his own home at 45. This cabin, the one he'd predicted would rot, was a comfortable, livable 61 degrees. He reached out and placed a hand on the interior log wall. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even cool. It was neutral, almost warm to the touch. He stomped his foot on the floorboards. They felt solid and impossibly not cold. He couldn't comprehend it. The physics of it were all wrong. He turned back to Eliza. The numbers were tumbling in his head, a furious calculation of disbelief. The Colby Ranch, 2 cords a month to hold 40 degrees. The Williams cabin, nearly 2 cords a month, struggling to stay at 38. Eliza Gable's cabin, less than a cord a month, holding steady at 61 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. It was a different reality altogether. Silas Blackwood, a man whose pride was rooted in his competence and his knowledge of wood and weather, stood in the middle of that warm room, defeated. He looked at Eliza, at her calm, steady gaze. He looked at the boy playing happily on the floor. He understood. He had been fighting the winter. She had made peace with the earth. He finally spoke, his voice raspy and low. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain it away. He delivered a terse, honest admission. Eliza, he said, meeting her eyes, I've been building houses wrong my whole life. That was the moment. The vindication wasn't in her saying, I told you so. She never did. The vindication was in that simple, profound confession from the man who had been her most knowledgeable critic. The real proof wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the quality of life. Thomas did his schoolwork at the table without shivering. Eliza cooked meals in a simple dress. They slept soundly through the night, without having to wake every 2 hours to feed a ravenous stove. Her system didn't just keep them from freezing. It gave them back their dignity. It turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. Word of Silas's visit spread like wildfire. When the blizzard finally broke in mid-January, a trickle of visitors began. First came Mr. Davies, the county agent, this time without his pamphlets. He brought a calibrated thermometer. He measured the outside air, the inside air, the temperature of the dirt in the berm, the floorboards. He took meticulous notes, his professional skepticism melting into scientific awe. He confirmed Eliza's numbers. He documented her fuel consumption. This wasn't luck. It was data. By the end of winter, half the valley knew something impossible was happening in the Widow Gables' strange, sunken house. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, stunned respect. The spread of an idea doesn't happen all at once. It starts with one person, then another. The first convert was Martha Colby. Her husband was one of the ranchers who had laughed the loudest at the gravedigger widow. But after losing 30 head of cattle and spending a winter watching his children huddle by the stove, he was humbled. In the spring, Martha came to see Eliza. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for instructions. Their cabin was larger on a different slope. They couldn't replicate Eliza's design exactly, but they grasped the principle. That summer, they didn't dig a full trench, but they banked their walls high and thick with earth, all the way to the eaves, and piled straw against the foundation. It was a simpler variation, a less elegant solution. But the following winter, which was cold by any normal standard, they cut their wood consumption by more than half. Their house held a steady 55 degrees. For them, it was a miracle. Their success broke the dam of skepticism. By the summer of 1905, 7 more families were banking their homes with thick earthen berms. 12 more followed the year after that. People shared knowledge, improvising on Eliza's design. Some used sawdust from Silas's mill as an insulator. Others built stone retaining walls to hold the berms in place. It became known simply as the Gable Method. Mr. Davies, the county agent, became Eliza's greatest champion. He published a bulletin through the state's Agricultural Extension Service titled Subterranean Insulation and Thermal Banking, a case study in low-cost winterization. It was dry and academic, but it was filled with his data. Temperature charts, fuel consumption comparisons, diagrams of the trench and berm. It gave an official stamp of approval to what Eliza had discovered through observation and necessity. The bulletin was copied and passed from county to county, and within a decade, variations of the Gable method were being used by homesteaders across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. What Eliza Gable built in 1903 with a shovel and common sense anticipated by nearly a century what building scientists would rediscover and call earth-sheltered construction. She had no formal training, no scientific instruments. She had a memory of a lighthouse cellar, a deep understanding of weather, and the fierce motivation of a mother protecting her child. Years later, when a visiting journalist asked her how she came up with such a revolutionary idea, she just shook her head, a small smile on her face. She was standing on the porch of the same cabin, now weathered and gray, but still solid, still warm. "It isn't new," she said, her voice still quiet after all those years. "The earth knows how to stay warm. I just listened. The structure still stands today, a private residence. The berm is grassed over, looking like a natural part of the landscape, but underneath, the principles are still at work. A quiet testament to a woman who faced down a community's scorn and a climate's fury, armed with nothing more than a shovel and a superior idea. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sake. It didn't care about what was in the manuals or what the neighbors thought. It rewarded what worked. Eliza Gable's simple, elegant solution worked better than anything anyone had ever seen. And in doing so, it didn't just keep one family warm. It taught a whole community a new way to survive. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for one proven frontier technique every week. And give this a like if it changed how you think about a simple pile of dirt. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized for narrative purposes, but the techniques are based on real historical practices of thermal mass banking and subterranean insulation used by pioneers and ancient cultures alike.